And it is a blank game week, so I have deliberately excluded some of the players who will blank. The idea of this cheat sheet is that it looks at some of the options that will be differentials on the 3-hit on 32, but also just generally suggests transfers going forward. My general principle is, if you're not free hitting this week, is to go for as many Liverpool and Arsenal players that you can that are within reason, and take hits to get those players in your team as soon as possible. No other teams are really ones that I'd like to target, at least over Liverpool and Arsenal this week, and I really don't think many people actually have 6 of them now. So if you don't plan on playing the free hit, that's basically my general advice. For the midfielders, you can see Andreas has been added to the cheat sheet. And the reason, of course, is seeing that Vinicius is no longer starting. Andreas is most likely going to be their penalty taker, and he is on a lot of set pieces as things stand. The only reason that I think Eze is a better option than him in the next tier is simply because Andreas doesn't actually play that many minutes. So there is obviously a high chance that Andreas becomes that 72, 75 minute substitute, which has actually happened many, many times now this season. So that's my one fear. Now, of course, Leeds have been shocking in recent games. And of course, you could argue that Everton are probably less poor than Leeds. And the reality is, Andreas is still someone who I would say doesn't have that much of a goal threat compared to someone like Eze. So that's kind of what makes me think Andreas is an interesting option, but not necessarily one that I'd immediately go for over some of the options that we have. Eze is the one option within the sort of budget midfield area that I actually think is going to be a great option for this week. If you look at some of the goal scoring odds, he rates really highly compared to many of the other midfielders. When we look at the Everton matchup as well, Everton have been a shocking team away from home. The XGC is really, really poor. And Eze has consistently for the last few years outperformed his underlying stats. So him actually having decent underlying stats, supplemented with the fact that he has been an above average finisher and also creator when it comes to meeting his underlying, suggests that he's going to be a good option, particularly on what would be his greatest matchup. The other positive for both Eze and Elise is that they have been playing 90 minutes each under Roy Hodgson, whereas under Patrick Vieira, you had a different circumstance where Eze and Elise were not necessarily starting games consistently, and also not finishing and seeing those games out with 90 minutes apiece. So Eze becomes one of the priority options for me because he just simply plays more minutes than Andreas. And with Daniel James, it's a similar situation there where he could be an early sub as well. So I don't really like that beyond the fact that they get to play Leeds that honestly look horrendous. As far as Martinelli, he becomes a prime option this week. We will maybe get some Arsenal news because Arsenal will be the first fixture, and that will be on Friday night, UK time. Arsenal is the team to target here, really, if you don't have the opportunity, or you already have, let's say, players like Salah and Trent in your team. I would say getting that last Arsenal attacker is the right decision to make. The question, of course, for many free-hitting players is going to be about Martinelli versus Odegaard, because I think a lot of people are still very high on Saka, and Arteta's comments do very much suggest that Saka will stay on penalties. So the question is, how do you compare Martinelli and Odegaard? I would probably suggest that Odegaard is a better option long term if you're not free hitting, but then as a free hitter, I think Martinelli becomes an exquisite option. I still think he'll start. The goal scoring odds are of course higher for him than someone like Odegaard, who's projected more to be a creator this week. And yeah, for that reason, I like Martinelli going forwards. With Martinelli, of course, you have different weeks where the minutes will probably come into play and actually make Odegaard a more appealing asset on the long term. But for 1 week, short term versus a really weak opponent, I think Martinelli becomes interesting because the chances that Arsenal score are quite high, particularly with Martinelli being involved in them. Gakpo has been added to the cheat sheet as well this week, and I actually think he immediately becomes the top option. The reason why is he is the second best Liverpool attacker in my opinion, at least when you're constructing free hit draft templates. I wouldn't necessarily consider him as an out and out transfer if I was just simply playing without a free hit. However, Gakpo seems like he's nailed to start this match. The reason why is because Jurgen is quite fond of this team structure. He's also competing for this position versus Firmino, whereas Darwin, I would say, is more worthy of minutes in that left wing position that Jota is currently playing in. The nice little thing about someone like Gakpo too is if you look at his minutes and when he was rested, it seems to be on those midweek matches. So Chelsea and Wolves were the games where he was rested, and those were both Wednesday and Tuesday matches. As far as Saka, of course, he gets a rise as well, and that's straight after missing the penalty too. Look, the reality is he has these great home games, and for this week specifically, I really can't see myself going with a three-hit draft that actually excludes Saka from my team. As far as Maddison and Bowen, the reason why they both don't get rank rises or tier rises is simply because, for me, Maddison has been shocking for the most part. His best display was against what I would describe as Man City B, something that I've said multiple times before. Of course, it's good to see that, he was able to perform well in that game, but for the most part, this Leicester team have been very, very hapless, and this Wolves team don't seem to be an absolute joke. So I would say that Maddison is not on my mind in a free hit. I know a lot of people will still lean towards Maddison, but watching him for the latest weeks and simply looking at Leicester as a cohesive team, their ability to actually build on chances, it's not really impressive that their best chance was Iheanacho almost getting a tap in off of a set piece. Now, of course, Maddison is a set piece taker, but overall, you'd like to see Maddison be more involved in open play and in multiple of the other easier fixtures that he's had earlier in this run towards Wolves. And because he hasn't shown that, I just really can't support him as a great option to go for. With Bowen, I just feel like he's a low ceiling player just based on this season. He's been taken off the penalties. He's been quite creative, I'd say, consistent with last year. But the goals, given that he, of course, scored versus Arsenal, that's going to be a little bit of a contradictory statement for a few. But the reality is his underlying stats when it comes to expected goals per 90 has dropped off from last season. And of course, this is an away game as well. So that's going to be quite tough for West Ham. Although I do think that West Ham have what it takes to maybe even sneak a clean sheet versus a team like Bournemouth, because they have been a decent defense, I'd say, for the most part of this year. Third on away expected goals conceded, but also if you look contextualized with the World Cup, more around mid-table. As far as Salah, he becomes the prime option this week and the prime candidate for the captaincy. So I would just simply recommend that the only note is to put your captaincy on him or find a way to get him into your team this week. Any sort of hits taken should prioritize going towards Salah first, as opposed to someone like Trent, who for me is the second priority option for this week. As far as the forwards, if we move over to that, Vinicius falls because we saw him actually get benched in the previous game. And that's very alarming because, of course, it seems like Marco Silva is probably more than likely going to utilize false nines going forwards, now that he probably doesn't have that much faith in Vinicius as a player. As far as Isak and Wilson, this is an interesting territory where I do think Isak can actually be a great differential on the free hit. But as a transfer this week, it's not really a serious transfer. Tottenham have been a really poor team, and defensively, we've actually seen them concede a lot. Their expected goals conceded numbers have been poor, and I'm not really seeing much of a change in environment of Tottenham to suggest that they're going to do well versus Newcastle. Newcastle have been exquisite at home, both from the attacking point of view and also defensively. So I would love to go for Isak this week on a free hit. But there are obviously a lot of competing players, and you can see that with players like Solanke, Watkins, Jesus, and Tony. Tony, of course, look, there might be a chance he gets suspended before the game, but you'll probably know before the deadline, so I won't say that Tony is anything but a green option. That's why Tony gets the rise. And Tony actually has really good odds alongside someone like Watkins, who's actually showed exquisite form, both on underlying data, but also just consistency within actual goal output as well. This Aston Villa team have probably outperformed expectations from a defensive point of view too, which we'll move on and discuss in the defender and goalkeeping section. But Watkins is probably the one asset I'd be the most scared of with not having at this point in time. I think he's just been on scintillating run of form. The numbers post Emery have been really good for Aston Villa, and Watkins has shown to be both a creative player as well, and also someone who is, true talisman, just like Tony. With Jesus, the interesting thing, of course, this Arsenal team has a lot of players that can get involved. So you have players like Saka, Martinelli, and Odegaard who equally can get involved in the attack, but Jesus still is the one who hoards probably the most amount of chances and is also equally capable of creating those chances as a striker, which is something that I would say is quite appealing. It's very similar to Kane in that aspect. If Kane had a good week and a good fixture. However, with Jesus, I think the one concern is going to be minutes. You have this overlay between this impending game versus Southampton and then 5 minutes of rest before they actually play the most important game of their season, which is going to be versus City. The question, of course, is whether Jesus will get the business done, within the 75 minutes that he's probably going to play before being rested ahead of the City game. I would actually like to say that it might make sense to actually go for some of the midfielders who would play a little bit more minutes and get you that sort of guarantee there, alongside the just simple opportunity here that Arsenal have a great shot of getting a clean sheet at home versus a very hapless Southampton team. Now, Southampton, of course, scored that sort of one goal with it, one shot versus City, and you might think that there's a high chance that will happen again. I don't tend to really believe into stuff like that. I do think that this is a great opportunity to go for an Arsenal defender as well. So that's sort of why I feel like Jesus is not that much of a 100% nailed on option for my free hit. However, I would not discredit anyone going for Jesus. He's a fantastic option this week. And ultimately, there are 5 great Arsenal players to go for this week, probably even 6 if you include Ben White. And I wouldn't say that any triple up is especially bad compared to the other. As far as Jota and Darwin, Jota actually joins the cheat sheet, whereas Darwin actually falls on it. The reason why Jota joins is because we've had some really positive comments about Jurgen Klopp and the amount of pressing that his team does. And Jota has played into back-to-back games now. I would say he had a rather quiet first half, especially when it comes to the offensive point of view. I'd say he actually made quite a few incorrect passes, but potentially what Jota is regarded for within Klopp in this system currently is the ability for him to actually press effectively and actually make these ball recoveries in the midfield. So that has actually really helped Liverpool support their pressing overall. And with this sort of new introduction of Trent into the team as one of the midfielders alongside Fabinho at times, particularly when they're in open play, it seems like Jurgen Klopp has found a sort of starting 11 that he actually really enjoys and really likes playing. There is effectively a week of rest until this Nottingham Forest game, so I feel like Jota is more than likely going to start over Darwin, and with Darwin now having consistent benchings, that's going to simply just drop him. He always is going to have a high goal scoring ceiling, in my opinion, as long as he starts, but now that he's no longer starting, I think Darwin's not too serious of an option. You could gamble on him on a free hit, but I would definitely not think about him as a regular transfer. As far as Kane, he falls as well. The run of games is really, really poor going forwards, and ultimately you're going to be looking at your team structure in the future, whether you're on a free hit or not, to pretty much remove Kane from your team in place of Salah and some budget forward. Probably Solanke or someone like Vinicius if you just are, or Greenwood, for example, if you're just looking for someone to just paper over the cracks and spend a little bit of your excess budget somewhere else. So Kane has to fall for that reason. Ultimately, I don't think many people can afford a team structure that actually incorporates Kane, Salah, and Haaland unless you're sacrificing some of the other exceptional forwards that we have. And because the best forwards really are in that 7.0 to 7.9 territory, with exception to Solanke, I have to say that Kane has to fall as well, just because that's how the template will move. As far as the defenders this week, most of it is built around Arsenal being still a fantastic team, so no changes there. And the premiums, Trippier and Alexander-Arnold, have stayed exactly the same. We've recognized them as premiums for a while now, and Trent has actually increasingly become a better option. I went for a hit for him last week, and I'm very happy with the result. As far as Newcastle, though, they would still fall overall for me, just because right now the priority to actually get two Newcastle defenders isn't that present. We have a high likelihood that this Brighton game will probably be rescheduled to 36, 37, those sorts of game weeks, and that's quite far away still. So there's no real need to actually hold double Newcastle defense. They do paper over the cracks in game week 33 particularly well, but on game week 34, you're probably only going to play Trippier as your sole single game week player. And so for that reason, I don't really like having a double up of Newcastle defense. It's more than likely that you'll be benching that player on as your fourth or fifth player in defense in that week. So there's no real reason to say that, Botman and Burn, players like Shar are a priority. On the other hand, you have Holding and Konate, who could be interesting options for now. I would say Holding is someone that I wouldn't say is a very serious option, but on a free hit, if you really wanted to go left field, for example, and pick an Arsenal option that no one else would have, I guess Holding would be your guy. But for now, I don't really like him as an option. As far as Konate, he's going to be an interesting option, both for people who are looking at a free hit and maybe looking for someone who could be a set piece threat, and someone who actually has shown some threat as well in recent games, especially when you see the sort of late last minute chance versus Ramsdale, and someone who actually probably will, going forwards, will be a part of that back two permanently. Konate has recently shown some exquisite advanced tackling whilst also committing a huge mistake versus Sinistera. Take that of what you will, but I really feel like that Konate's aggression is actually something that has matched up really well with someone like Van Dijk, who's played a little bit more patiently than I would say in previous years. And so that sort of balance, I think, really fits this Liverpool centre-back partnership really well, and it's something that Klopp really likes. And I think the fact that Klopp has started, as I said, the starting lineup twice back-to-back probably suggests that that's his go-to team. You will have an option, of course, where maybe Liverpool will have to midweek rest some players. Players like Firmino will come on and start. Players like Matip might have an opportunity to play, even Joe Gomez. But for now, I think Konate is actually, at his good price, actually a good option to think about within this Liverpool team. However, you probably still want to attack the ceiling of Liverpool this week. So if you're free hitting, I would not really recommend Konate. As far as Anderson/Guehi, definitely options that can be seriously thought about on the free hit. And the particular value of Anderson Guehi, since everyone seems to be going for John Stone as their keeper, is, of course, if you don't go for John Stone as your keeper. And alternatively, if you actually wanted to look at something like a Jesus plus Gakpo team setup in your free hit. Because if you go for Jesus and Gakpo, you will need a third defender. A lot of people would have Robertson usually, but if you go for Gakpo, that's not the case. And if you go for someone like Jesus, it probably also means that you're going to drop Gabriel or White from your team. So therefore, you'll have Trippier plus Trent Alexander-Arnold, and you'll need someone else. And Anderson Guehi might be the best option just because the Crystal Palace clean sheet is so high. As clean sheet odds are so high. As far as Zuma and Alex Moreno, these are two, I would say, differential options. Alex Moreno is someone who's quite interesting because his expected goal involvement actually puts him level with someone like Andy Robertson this season. So that's going to be quite exciting for people who actually want to go for someone who has been a recently well-performing asset, but also actually has really good underlying data to support that. So that's interesting. Moreno was something like 0.22 expected goal involvements, or at least expected assists. So that's really, really good for a fullback. As far as Zuma, of course, you always know that he's going to be a set-piece threat, but is he that serious of a set-piece threat, and is it that good of a matchup versus a rather informed team in Bournemouth? I would say probably not. Bournemouth have been consistently pulling out some really good XG numbers. The numbers, particularly if you look at the cutoff point of the World Cup, have been really good for Bournemouth. So that's why I would say Zuma isn't that interesting. 5.0 to 5.4, as I said, Schär falls. No real changes there for Gabriel and Zinchenko. And then at 5.5 plus, the reason why I upped Van Dijk is I was quite concerned about that sort of random rest, but it seemed like one of those classic red zone rests for Liverpool. And I can't really see Van Dijk being taken off the team. He's probably going to play this match in Nottingham Forest and most of the games, even including the double in Game Week 34. And so for that reason, I think Van Dijk's an exceptional option since Nottingham Forest have actually really poor stats when it comes to, first of all, defending versus corners, but also actually giving corners away. So that's going to be Van Dijk as a good option for the free hit, particularly if you believe in the bullet header case scenario. As far as the goalkeepers this week, you have a situation where Johnson, of course, is a priority keeper, and the Raya actually gets a rise because I think this is a great independent fixture for Raya. Aston Villa will probably create a lot of chances, but as we know, Raya is a fantastic shot stopper and someone who makes an insane amount of saves, enough to actually, for example, level the goalkeeper who actually gets a clean sheet. So that's why Raya is always going to be an interesting option. That's going to be the goalkeepers this week. A little bit easier. I just don't really like Pope and Alisson because you're probably going to go for Trippier, you're probably going to go for Trent, and you want more upside from Liverpool, unless of course Alisson does the last minute goal again or gets an assist. With Leno, of course, you're almost looking at a worse version of Raya here, even though Leeds are actually a much easier matchup when it comes to hoping that they don't actually score. So that's going to be the Game Week 32 cheat sheet, and I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead.